So thanks for coming to the talk today. I'm going to try and keep it in the spirit of the name, as relaxing as possible, conversational as possible. Try and keep my comments to about 30 minutes or so. And the last time I actually did a relax, some of you I think were here. That feedback was very integral in what I can actually hold up now. My book, my first book, just came to me a few weeks ago, was just published with Cambridge University Press. And the feedback from that relax was really integral. And with this project I'm going to talk about today, I'm also at the very early stages of it, like I was back in 2018 with that project. So your feedback, your comments, your questions are going to be really helpful here. So I really appreciate those. Now this project today, I'm going to be talking about this individual. His name is Imad Nuwayhid. And for those who don't know much about the methodology of microhistory, what it is using an individual or a locality to a specific place to speak to bigger historical trends of a particular period. So the arguments that I'm making here are that Imad's life, and I mentioned these in the abstract, so hopefully they don't come out of nowhere, that Imad's life as an Arab leftist in the global 60s can tell us a lot about the dilemma young leftists were caught in during that time period, caught between engaging in global capitalism and calling for its destruction. And then as it relates to the Lebanese Civil War, he as an individual and others like him were appropriated as symbols during the war by parties to the war as recruitment tools, but not without resistance, is the claim I'll be making there. So before we get to those claims, I want to tell you a little bit about how I discovered Imad, or more aptly, how he's discovered me. And I think everyone here today hasn't heard me talk about this research yet, so hopefully it won't be too repetitive. But the first time I saw Imad was in the archives during dissertation field work in the microfilm reading room at Jaffet Library at American University of Beirut. I was pouring through newspapers from the early Civil War era. The Lebanese Civil War started in 1975. And in this particular issue of the Lebanese Communist Party's daily, El Nida, I saw this picture of this individual, and it reads under him, the comrade martyr Imad Nuwayhid. A day before that, which was actually 40 years ago on Wednesday, he and two other individuals were shot in a battle with an organization called this was in the context of the Lebanese Civil War, about 6 months in. He was shot by fighters of the Kataib Party. The Kataib Party was on one side of the war, alongside the Lebanese army, and then Imad was fighting for the Lebanese Communist Party along with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So I saw his picture there. There was a little bit of information on him. And if this is the only picture I would have ever seen of Imad, I don't think that I'd be here today talking about him. But he came up again in the archives. In this particular volume in 1980, there's the Arabic title there, Martyrs of the Lebanese Communist Party, 1975 to 1980, for the sake of you, O nation. Here I had a lot more biographical information on Imad, some more things that I'll talk about later. So I had a little bit more to go off of, but for about 4 years, because I got this in 2012, this is all I had to go off of. But after that, through a few Google searches, some cold call emails, or some cold emails, if you will, I got in touch with members of his family. And they gave me access to a lot of his personal sources, writings of his, translations of his that I will talk about throughout this presentation, work certificates and educational certificates that date from about 1965 to 1970, and letters that he wrote home, he was in Europe traveling, that he wrote home or to home from about 1966 to 1971. So I pair these personal sources with what scholars refer to as martyr narratives, these reports about individuals or parties to war that die in war, And I mentioned this initial report from 1975, and the remembrances of Imad actually stretch all the way to 1985. I've seen primary sources that mention Imad. I pair that with interviews with his friends, his family members, and comrades of his that I conducted between 2016 to 2020. I've continued this project, even though I haven't been to Lebanon since 2018. I've conducted, I've done emails back and forth with individuals, so email correspondence. So the story that I'm about to tell you here as relates to Imad's life and death comes from these different sources. So we'll start with his life. So Imad was born in the village of Ras al-Metin in 1944. Ras al-Metin is a village an hour east of Beirut, and it is predominantly Druze Muslim. For those who don't know what Druze are, it is a Muslim minority in Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine. It's quite quietist, meaning it doesn't talk too much about its beliefs. But to be clear here, Imad definitely, sorry, I'm submitting someone here. Imad, he cared about his family, and I think family meant a lot to him, but religion, I wouldn't say as much. And we can talk about that a little bit during the question and answer. So, so he lives in Ras al-Metin throughout his childhood, his early youth years, and then he starts high school in Beirut in 1963 at this high school called Zarif High School. And Zarif, I've learned from some of his comrades, friends, and some secondary literature as well, that it was a leftist stronghold in the 1960s, largely for intellectual movements. In the 1960s, there was a flowering of them in Lebanon during this time period. And Imad definitely engaged in Marxist reading circles and things along those lines. By the summer of 1965, he actually starts working for the Intercontinental Phoenicia Hotel, and you can see his ID badge here. This was about a year before he graduated from high school. The Phoenicia was a hotel that opened in Beirut in 1961, and for those who don't know much about the Intercontinental Hotel Group, it was a subsidiary of Pan American Airways. And both of these things were part of US foreign policy, or basically using international tourism to foster friendly relations with different countries and US foreign policy interests. So Imad graduates from high school in 1966, and then he starts his internship in Hanover, Germany in 1966 at the Intercontinental Hotel in Hanover. So he works for the Intercontinental Hotel Group for 10 years, but this is his first internship from 66 to 67. And this is where we have access to his letters that he wrote to home. And he wrote about a lot. He basically, over the years, I have about access to 20 or so letters that he wrote home. And during this internship in Germany, he wrote about the people he met. He wrote about his engagements with socialism there. He wrote a lot about gender relations, which I could talk about during the Q&A if interested. But maybe he wrote most on darker times away from home. I'm going to give you a few quotes here. Imad complained that, quote, "The weather is very bad here in Hanover. Essential things, including food and transport, are very expensive, and that he worked daily for more than 12 hours without pay," end quote. Yet he still believed that this unpaid internship is, quote, "for my benefit and my future," as he gained work experience across different sectors of the hotel. He made friends of different ethnicities and learned German, both during his stint in room service and at a language institute. Just for reference, I'm referencing a paper that I'm working on right now. So whenever I'm reading quotes, that's what I'm referencing there. So his internship in Hanover actually coincided with some big developments at home. The Arab-Israeli War of 1967, or the Six-Day War of 1967, as maybe some of you know it referred to. Lebanon did not participate in the war, but it was really foundational to Lebanese political history in two ways. One, it really divided political culture in Lebanon, basically between people who would support the Palestinian Liberation Organization and its armed attacks on Israel from Lebanon, and those who were completely against that. And Imad was definitely in the former camp. Tied to that, many of the leftist movements that Imad would have encountered in the 1960s, post-1967, really shifted their politics to focus on the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Palestinian struggle, and specifically this idea that Arab heads of state had failed the Palestinian cause, so leftists from the Arab world had to take it into their own hands to actually redeem Palestine and gain back Palestinian territory. Given these ideas that he had, this remarkable thing that Imad did is maybe made it a little bit less remarkable because we know a little bit about his ideas. But in 1969, he translates from French to Arabic this book right here. I won't give the French translation. Don't want to entirely, or the French title. I don't want to butcher it there. But it is The Jewish Question According to Marxism, written by Abraham Leon. And you see here the Arabic title page of it. And actually at the bottom here, underneath that title, you'll see Imad's name in Arabic. So I'll tell you a little bit about Leon. So Leon was a notable Belgian Jewish anti-Zionist communist who actually died in Auschwitz in the 1940s. And he wrote in The Jewish Question According to Marxism that Zionism, the political ideology of the state of Israel, would do nothing to solve Jewish suffering, especially under capitalism. The only thing that would be a worldwide socialist, Trotskyist planned economy. That was his argument in short, and I can talk more about that during the Q&A. But so Imad translates this work, and actually not the only individual who translated this from French to another language. It's been translated into English, and the New Left in the United States was also very interested in the work of Abraham Leon, especially after the Six-Day War, the 67 war, the Arab-Israeli War of 1967. But Imad, well, actually, I'll tell you one other thing. There's two theories on how Imad came to translate this, and I can talk about them more during the Q&A. One claims that he encountered this work when he was traveling around France. The other was when he was back in Lebanon engaging with his old leftist friends and they read this work. Regardless, in the introduction to the translation, Imad says himself why he translated this book. So let's hear his words. So he said he translated this book from French to Arabic for, quote, the enrichment of the Arab Revolution in a social scientific study, as to help it understand clearly the nature of the Zionist enemy, so the Arab and Palestinian popular crowds could realize the destruction of the Zionist entity, end quote. Imad's rationale clearly straddles the intellectual and activist planes, but the latter seems more pressing here to Imad. To read about these connections, Imad believed would lead, quote, vengeful Arab people inspired by Arab struggle to wrestle the struggle from the grips of Arab regimes who were not radical, and hence why they met a series of defeats in the face of Israel. Only then could the Arabs and Palestinians avenge the defeat by the enemy, end quote. So Imad was definitely a radical in the making in terms of his politics, but at the exact same time, he was quite practical. He pursued, only a few months after this book was published in Arabic, hospitality management school in Lausanne, Switzerland, from 1969 to 1970. And he actually talked about this school in his letters when he was in Hanover years earlier. So he had discovered this school earlier and enrolled about 3 or 4 years later. So he does hospitality management school in Lausanne, Switzerland. Thereafter, in the spring months of 1971, he's in London for a few months. He wrote some letters back home from there as well. He works at a hotel. And then thereafter, he comes back to Lebanon and he lives the rest of his life in Lebanon. In 1973, according to the Lebanese Communist Party, is when he joins the Lebanese Communist Party. Some of his friends and cousins and family members telling me he joined this party. He was in leftist intellectual groups, but he joined this party in particular because of its working class foundations and because of its reputation at the time for being a party that would defend the Palestinian Liberation Organization physically, not just rhetorically, like actually on the streets against the Lebanese army. This coincides with military training that Imad actually did either in Syria or Jordan in 1973 with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Interestingly enough, he told his parents in 1973, when he was in Syria or Jordan, that he was working at a hotel in Europe. But he went to go train with the Fedayeen, with the commandos of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1973. When he gets back to Lebanon, he continues working at the hotel, the Intercontinental Phoenicia Hotel. He's studying to become a lawyer, actually. And this picture was taken, according to his sister told me this, on October 28th, 1975. And just to note here, if Imad was alive today, he would have been about 76 years old. So on that day of October 28th, him and two other fighters, the Lebanese Communist Party, they were walking in West Beirut, and they were supposedly shot by fighters of the snipers of the Kataib Party. One of his brothers tell me that Imad was actually undercover, he was behind a building, and the other two individuals were shot in the open street. Imad supposedly went out to go get these people undercover, and that's where he was shot. He was rushed to a hospital for blood transfusions and died under operation that evening. And this is really where this moment, literally the day after his death, that information starts pouring out about him in the Lebanese communist press and the leftist press more broadly. So these martyr narratives that I was talking about in the introduction as I switched to talking about his death. So we have a sampling here of some of the quotes from different types of martyr narratives. The first is a poem. The second is a quote from a rally, and the third is a letter in remembrance. So this first one, it's actually a poem from a member of the Lebanese Communist Party the day after Imad and those two other individuals were killed. Their names are Mohammed and Diab, and hence why they're mentioned here. And here is the quote from this poem. "And all you comrades, remember Mohammed, Diab, and Imad for the complete elimination of this plague and salvation of our Lebanese people from the evils and their crimes." The evils and the crimes that are being mentioned here are of the Kataib Party, a right-wing militia that killed Imad, and the Lebanese state that supported that militia. About 2 weeks later, there was this huge rally that took place in Beirut for Imad and 4 other fighters of the Lebanese left and Lebanese national movement that died in the war. And his family members told me that this was probably the most important event to remember Imad. Thousands of people came to this theater in Beirut, and a famous Lebanese leftist, who is actually now a very famous professor, historian at the American University of Beirut, said this quote, that Imad and others represent, quote, bullets in the face of colonization. A year later, the Lebanese Communist Party printed a letter in its newspaper from Imad's father. It was a remembrance letter, remembering Imad. And Yusuf, the father, wrote this: "When people remember him, Imad changes to thousands of Imads, driving comrades to cut through the rocks." So whether these quotes are the broader sources that they're in, Imad as an individual in his life is not talked about that much, which I think is completely understandable, given that these organizations were involved in a war, and that war, from their perspective, had to be won. But it's very interesting because it appears that when Imad, the individual, was spoken about at these events, which he was, those individuals and their words were blocked. So I wanted to tell you one story about this. There was a 40-day remembrance in Ras al-Metin, Imad's village. It's a tradition within Islam, 40 days after someone's death, to have a remembrance of sorts. And At this remembrance, supposedly hundreds of people were there. And on behalf of the family, a cousin of Imad, his name is Walid, spoke about Imad. And this is detailed in that El Nida, that's the Lebanese Communist Party's paper, report. And in that report, it mentions that Walid spoke about Imad's travels around Europe, a little bit about his ideas, and that he was a fighter. But when you read the report, it appears that he spoke much less than any of the other representatives, whether the Lebanese Communist Party was there, the PLO was there, representatives of the PLO were there, excuse me. And it appears that Walid spoke much less. But when I actually talked to Walid about this, who is living today, he claims, no, I did not speak much less than those individuals. I spoke for at least 15 minutes in detail about Imad's accomplishments intellectually, and some of the ideas that he had. But all that was printed in the paper was this, from Walid's 15-minute speech. Imad was, quote, a fighter in different planes. That was the only direct quote from Walid, although there were many more direct quotes from other representatives. To be clear, Walid's not angry about this. He's just cognizant about it. He understands why the Lebanese Communist Party would make this editorial decision. But other individuals in Imad's family weren't so happy about this appropriation and actually voiced their anger in different ways. So I wanted to tell you about one story. I'm going to read here from this from my paper, my article in progress, for this story, just for the sake of clarity. So this is a funeral procession that took place in Ras Al Matan the day after Imad died. And it talks about the actions of one family member, Imad's brother. His name is Jawad. Okay. So at one point during the procession, a Lebanese Communist Party member tried to help carry Imad's coffin and draped the coffin with a Lebanese Communist Party flag. Imad's brother, Jawad, then pulled the flag off the coffin and said, according to a cousin who was interviewing, and he's paraphrasing here, but this is what Jawad supposedly said, "Enough damage. You have done enough damage. Get out of here. I do not recognize you. He is not a part of you. He is us, a Nuwayhid. Enough is enough." End quote. A compromise was reached with the flag no longer laid on Imad, but moved to the side. Jawad confirms this story to me in an interview, adding that he beat up that Communist Party member who tried to claim his brother. This interview, like many of my interviews, are conducted in Arabic, but Jawad deliberately switched to English here and said to me, "I kicked that guy's ass." He really wanted to stress that point to me. In contrast, the party does not mention these skirmishes. In the party report on the funeral, it seems as if the procession went smoothly, as officials memorialized Imad's, quote, dedication in the battles for his people, for the great party, for giving his life for the sake of making victory and the basis of a new Lebanon, end quote. So what do I make of all this? And this is where I'll conclude and try and bring in some of those broader arguments that I mentioned in the beginning. Youth of the, in the three claims here, youth of the Arab left, much like Imad's and beyond, in this era of the global 60s, were caught between engaging in capitalism and calling for its destruction. So let's remember Imad's timeline here a little bit. Leftist in the mid-1960s, goes to Hanover for this internship, this job with the Intercontinental Hotel Group, comes back, translates the work of Leon, that very radical piece, and we obviously heard his words there about what he thought about what Zionism was and how it had to be destroyed. But then thereafter continues hospitality management school into the 1970s and continues at the same time military training with the PLO in 1973, but working at the Phoenicia Hotel throughout his entire life. So there's a lot of literature on this term that I'm using, the global 60s, that talks about it as a moment of simultaneity and interconnection between different protest movements, different causes. Think about what's going on in the United States with the Civil Rights Movement, Paris 68, the Vietnam War, etc. But we don't have a lot of research as it relates to individuals. And I think what we see here from Imad is this sort of back and forth between this dilemma of social protest and high capitalism. and actually reflects, one of my favorite quotes from a famous French filmmaker, Jean-Luc Godard. He called youth like Imad, but speaking in the context of France, children of Marx and Coca-Cola. This idea that they are Marxist intellectually, but in terms of their usefulness, can't help but engage in capitalism and in consumerism. And I can talk a little bit more about during the Q&A how Imad was a consumer and sort of engaged in these sort of cultural trends of the time. But there's a certain telling of Imad's life, which I try to avoid, that sort of sees this linear path towards radicalization. You have 67, you got the PLO stuff, and then he's in the war. I just see it a lot more murky than that, a lot more complex. I see it as a negotiation that an individual is going through between engaging in these multiple forces. I think there needs to be more research, and there definitely is another context of how young people engage this, but in the context of the Middle East, that is what this article and project is to do, see how this individual negotiation plays out. Second, in regards to his death, parties appropriate individuals as symbols for the war, but not without resistance here. So that claim that I was sort of making through talking about this these martyr narratives, the first part, that parties appropriate individuals to the war, this isn't a new claim. This is confirmed in the literature on martyr narratives, whether in the Soviet Union, the Cuban Revolution, North Korea, or even Lebanon. Parties to a war, they need bodies, not individuals, is how they see it. And hence they use these individuals and aspects of, minimal aspects of their biography as recruitment tools to get other people to join the cause, okay? But what we see when we go outside the martyr narrative in these ethnographies, these interviews, these personal sources, that it's not without resistance. Not everybody buys into this appropriation. To be clear, the majority of people actually do reinforce the martyr narrative. But I think it's very important to talk about someone like Jawad, who is written out of the archives, but definitely was resisting these party narratives. Third and finally, and this is a really important point, because I do not want to be, I don't want to fall into this, the parties were bad, the family was good dichotomy. Parties and families both engage in the politics of memorialization. This is something we see in Imad, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was replicated beyond. And what I'm gonna, so in terms of how parties engage in the politics of memorialization, I think I've already described that pretty well. I want to talk about the family side of it in my final minutes here. This is what I refer to as the process of cleaning the slate. And this has come up in a lot of interviews with family members today about how they remember Imad. First of all, some of his family members doubt that he was actually ever a member of the Lebanese Communist Party. They claim that he was a part of leftist causes, leftist intellectual movements, but that he never joined that party. Some of his family members vehemently disagree with that. They're like, no, we remember him joining the Lebanese Communist Party. And I think I'm a little bit more on that side, that he definitely joined the party. But in a particular discussion that I was having with brothers, sisters, spouses, and friends in Beirut in the summer of 2018, one of the family members yelled out during this conversation, directly looking at me, quite sort of apologetically, sarcastically, "Welcome to our communist family," was what they said to me. Being this idea, and this quote needs to be interpreted in a contemporary context, where the Lebanese Communist Party, the Arab left, and leftist causes have definitely fallen out of favor with the older generation, and with the younger generation are sort of interpreted in different ways. Second, in conversations with people today, we often talk about what would become of Imad's life. That seems very integral to their grieving process. Jawad, who I told you about, he was the individual who beat up the other Communist Party, or beat up the Communist Party member. He claims that Imad would reflect his views, and those views are that the Lebanese left, the PLO and the war were a waste of time, that they destroyed Lebanon. Another brother doesn't go that far. He says Imad would be a writer, but not a political one. He would think that Imad would be apolitical. Of course, his brothers know him very well. and they've given me unfettered access to all these documents. So I have to acknowledge that point a bit. But at the same time, their comments can definitely be interpreted as recasting Imad in their own image. These are their ideas today. They have accepted global capitalism. They have accepted that the war was a waste of time, and hence Imad would as well. But I also see these sort of corrective storytellings as an act of resistance in and of itself. So I don't want to think of resistance as very narrow. That is, that the only act of resistance we see in the story I told you is Jawad saying, no, you can't claim my brother. Actively creating new stories definitely challenges the hegemonic power of these parties and militias, even if those stories aren't exactly correct or do not really reflect Imad's beliefs as we see them in the archives. Those are my conclusions for now. I just want to really briefly just talk about what's next for this project. So I'm in the process of turning it into a journal article first, and then hopefully and that journal article will largely focus on points 2 and 3 here. Less on the first point, because that's actually a newer one for me. But points 2 and 3 is what the journal article will focus on. And hopefully, when travel is possible again, whenever that is, maybe 2021, maybe 2022, who knows? I have plans to go back to Lebanon for more interviews with family members, archival research, etc. I also plan at some point to go to Switzerland. The archives of the hospitality management school that he went to are actually quite robust. And the archivist has told me they have student files going back to the 1960s, so might be able to find something there. And then hopefully also the University of Miami in Florida that holds the archives for Pan American Airways and by extension Intercontinental Hotel Group. I didn't talk much about that, but I think this is going to be a big story of the book project. How the United States uses tourism as a form of informal empire. Yeah, and then hopefully it will turn into a book at some point, and that's why your feedback today will be so integral. So thank you so much, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Dylan. We have time for questions, and then we invite you all to join us for a little relaxation virtually. Any questions?
Hey, Dylan, got a question on sort of a broader issue that came to my mind as you were doing your talk. So you're talking about, the Arab left in the 60s as a broader group, and that made me think, to what extent is the Arab left pulling from Islam? Because like when we think about the left in the United States, whether it's in the 60s or today, it's a little bit more minimal, but we hear things like the Christian left as an opposition to the Christian right. Is there anything like an Islamic left in the Arab world, whether in the 60s or even today? I mean, I assume there is. I guess I wonder, to what extent is it there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'll speak more broad. I'll speak first to your first point in terms of like what role did religion play in the Arab left, and then I'll talk about sort of an Islamic left more broadly. So in terms of the role that religion played in the Arab left in the 1960s, it was quite minimal. It's to say that it was secular and it was largely Arab nationalist per se. So and this is getting a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's important. So you have the creation of the United Arab Republic, which was a union between Egypt and Syria from 1951 to 1961. After that union is destroyed and Arab nationalism is sort of challenged as the main ideological center of politics in the Arab world. And that is when you do have this emergence, this flowering in the early 1960s into the 1970s of a Arab left that is Marxist, that is secularist, or that's secular, that's Trotskyist. It's all of these things. So these individuals, so we saw, for example, Imad translate the work of Leon, Abraham Leon. Other leftist reading circles in Lebanon were reading Gramsci and translating Gramsci into Arabic. They were reading Mao. Trying to think of others that they, those are the main ones. And definitely secular in orientation, or focusing on the politics over, say, religious identity, because in the context of the Arab world during this time period, any sort of pre-Islamic revolution, pre-1979, religion and politics is seen as almost backwards. That you wouldn't want to do that if you're trying to prove yourself as to be a part of the left. But this is very important into the early 1970s in Lebanon. You have the movement of the deprived, which I'll talk about just really briefly. It's basically a predecessor to Hezbollah, which I think some of us have heard of. The Party of God in Lebanon, which was formed in the wake of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 and in the wake of the Islamic Revolution of 1979. So the movement of the deprived, which starts in 1974, was led by Musa Sadr, who is a famous Shia Islamic cleric, and he mixed Marxism and Shia Islam. And he was central to the left. He was friends with guys like Kamal Jumblat, who was another big leftist figure that I didn't mention. So at least in Lebanon, early 70s was kind of the flowering of what would be thought of as an Islamic left. In Egypt, it's happening closer to the late 1970s, but predating the Islamic Revolution. So in the context of Egypt, I told you about the United Arab Republic, that it failed by 1961. Gamal Abdel Nasser, some of you may know this individual. He dies in 1970. He dies in 1970. And the way Egyptian politics go thereafter, they make peace with Israel, they move towards the United States, they change their economy to an open market capitalist economy, and you definitely have the flowering of an Islamist opposition in that context in the early 70s, predating the Islamic Revolution of Iran. So it's there, Josh. In the context of Lebanon in the 60s, at least in terms of my own research, it is not as strong, but by the 1970s, it is growing in terms of the role that Islam is playing in the left.
All right, thanks, Dylan. That was enlightening. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for your question. Other questions? Okay. We have a couple chats in here. If there's no spoken ones, I think we'll go to those. So if you all know how to pull up your chat there, you can see Nicole Pacino and Steph Waring asking some questions here. So I'm not gonna. Well, I'll read them. So Nicole's asking, is there any evidence that Imad was exposed to Che Guevara's writings and ideas? I was struck by his father's use of the idea of thousands of Imad, which reminded me of Che's invocation of 2-3 many Vietnams as a call of anti-imperialist actions. I think that's a really good question, Nicole. So there isn't currently, and I'll tell you why I think that's the case. The Palestinian Liberation Organization and its cause really dominates the left in Lebanon, given that the PLO is based in Lebanon. And it's interesting because the PLO itself, and forget the author, but there's a book called The Global Offensive, which is all about how the PLO sort of used Vietnam, used Che, used Mao for its images. But the Lebanese left in specific seems very, how should I say, invested in the PLO and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, movements within that, and kind of translating and working within their ideas more so than translating, say, Che or Mao or whatnot. At the same time, so I don't have Che references. Also, at least in Imad's writing, he never references Vietnam, which if you actually, if you guys may remember, I think it was 2 years ago now, I brought Maha Nassar to campus. She wrote that book, Brothers Apart, which is about Palestinian citizens of Israel. She wrote an article recently in a volume on the global 60s about how Palestinian activists, Israeli Palestinian citizens of Israel in the 1960s were referencing Vietnam and were referencing China. So you see that, but I do not see that in Imad's writings. The only other thing that I can mention is one volume of the 1980s that was dedicated to Martyrs, the Lebanese Communist Party. It wasn't the one I showed, it's another one. It was in 1985. Mentions that Imad was in the progress of writing a book called China, Communist China After 30 Years. And it wasn't a translation, it was his own monograph about China. One of his family members confirmed this, but I don't know much about it. And I think the problem is, I would assume if I had more, the most detailed writings I have from Imad are from about 69 to 71. I feel like if I had things a little bit later, we would see more references to Mao, we'd see more references to Che, and we'd see more references to the Vietnam War. Now that's purely speculation, but based on other research from the Arab world, that seems to be the case. So great question though. And that's why I need to do, for example, I have an email in writing in the making, hopefully, I haven't sent it out yet, to Imad's cousin Walid, basically asking him, tell me as much as you can about this Communist China Through 30 Years book. So that will be unfolding. Yeah. So Steph, I think it's a great question. Should we be surprised that radicals are working at capitalist jobs? I don't think we should be surprised. And I think it's extremely normal. And I hope that it didn't sound as if I was sort of pointing this out as some sort of hypocrisy. I think it's extremely normal. And I think its normalcy is what's compelling. But I think at the individual level, this negotiation hasn't been written about as much, at least in the Arab world, maybe beyond. And maybe that's where I need y'all's help, whether it's people working on the left, the new left in the United States, and maybe some of the paradoxes or contradictions that are playing out there, or in Latin America as well, or beyond. I think a lot of the story often about the new left is about the fracturing, the ideological fracturing, which you do see in the context of Lebanon, but you don't see much with this this individual negotiation. I think the more biographical history that we add to this, we can kind of think about, okay, how was it to be young left and caught between these dilemmas? And to be clear, young leftists like Imad and others, they couldn't avoid global capitalism, and they were always definitely geared towards its destruction and activism towards such. So yeah, I don't think that it's surprising, but I think it's something that I want to highlight at the individual level. Okay. And then he's fat. Yeah, Steph said he looks like a fashionable man. The picture that the Lebanese Communist Party actually went. I'll show you real quick. Let's go back. Yeah, the picture at the top there that was in the Lebanese Communist Party's daily. When I reminded his family members and his friends that that's what they printed, they're like, why the heck did they print that picture? He looks so goofy in that. Like, that's not the Imad they knew. The Imad they knew was in picture 2 and 3, which I think is really interesting. Maybe the Lebanese Communist Party wanted to make him look a little bit official. That picture, even though he almost looks older in it, I think that's his high school picture, that first one there. Andre wrote in, is Imad's story unique in the life of the communist or youth movement in Lebanon at the time? I don't think so. I think he's an exceptional individual in terms of his translation, his dedication to these ideas, and he wasn't trained as a translator, but this translation is immaculate from French to Arabic. I have friends who are translators who operate in the Arab world, and they've read through this translation. They've looked at the French and the Arabic, and they're like, this guy looks like he's a professional translator. So he was unique and maybe exceptional in that way. But like I just kind of mentioned, I find that what is equally compelling about Imad is his normalcy. Young people in Lebanon and focusing on those people in the left who grow up in the 1960s, come of age in that era, and many of which that died in the Lebanese Civil War. I mean, the majority of people that fought in the Lebanese Civil War were what we would classify youth, ages 15 through 24, or maybe a little bit earlier. The casualties of the Lebanese Civil War were about 200,000 people died. I think that he, as an individual, his normalcy is what is compelling. And a lot of the literature on Lebanon focuses on martyrdom. It focuses on collective memory, important topics in my studies building off of that. We know much less about individuals who actually fought in this war. And that is, what I'm trying to do as best as possible, reconstruct, albeit imperfectly through the sources I have, what one's life was like leading up to that moment. And then how to remember thereafter. Other questions? I would love some spoken ones. I mean, I don't mind text, but I feel like I've been reading a lot. Yeah, John.
Thinking about the public memory of this, was Imad really positioned as an individualistic martyr, or was he branded more as a collective, like with the other two that got shot? So when the stories are being appropriated for official uses or whatever, are they focusing primarily on him as an individual or him as a member of a group, since there were 3 that were killed at the same time?
That's a really good question. And actually, I'm just taking a screenshot of this chat real quick because there's some really good questions there. I want to make sure that I get them, but I got that now. So that is a great question. So he is framed as an individual martyr. So I can tell you a little bit more about the reason that I've stuck with him because promotional martyrdom in the context of the Lebanese Civil War was very common. Especially as the casualties go up, you see more and more pictures. So there's plenty of individuals to follow. But there is more on Imad than there is on Diab and Muhammad Maki, those 2 other individuals. So in that first report, I did just show you the picture of Imad, John, but in that first report, they were all packaged together, okay? But thereafter, the individual ceremonies to Imad and letters about Imad were definitely more in density than Muhammad and Diab. You do have little like reports of funeral ceremonies or like calls for like, hey, we're having a funeral ceremony for Muhammad, for example, in this village. But there's a lot more text and a lot more sort of pageantry, I would say, around Imad. And I think the reason is this. So we need to talk about a little bit about Diab and Muhammad accordingly. Diab and Muhammad were from South Lebanon. I haven't looked nearly as closely into their biography, but it is much less remarkable, to be fair. They came from humble backgrounds, and they were more sort of aligned with what was often seen as the rank and file of the Lebanese Communist Party. They were Shia Muslims, which the Lebanese Communist Party actually had a sizable Shia Muslim demographic, although it was very diverse. And they were lower class, or they were from the lower classes. So although there is a little bit of promotional martyrdom on them, I think the reason that Imad becomes a thing is because in its abstraction, it worked very well as a recruitment tool. Look at this guy. He was an intellectual. He gave up the pen. He gave up everything for the cause. But the specifics of his intellectual endeavors are never mentioned that much, right? So as an abstraction, but I think that's why he was kind of put up there, John, as an individual, as opposed to maybe say a collective one. But there are plenty of posters, martyrdom posters that do focus on the collective. Like you'll see, like, for example, a poster that just has 40 individuals of men and women, or 40 pictures of young men and women, not with names. But Imad was never really a part of something like that. And I think the Lebanese Communist Party definitely thought that they could use him, and that that he was sort of engaged in these leftist circles for some time. He had translated this work. He could really be used in kind of a symbol of this transformation from intellectual to fighter.
Well, do you think there's a parallel because I'm thinking like with the Rosa Parks story in Montgomery. There were several that got arrested for not moving or refusing to get off of buses, but one had died, one actually put up a big fight, but when it came to Rosa Parks, King and the other leaders in Montgomery said, this is the one.
Yeah.
So they really glommed onto her and her specific image to end up leading into what was the Montgomery bus boycott. Do you think this was a similar kind of thing in that they were waiting for the right martyr to become that recruiting tool, and the first two guys
weren't that?
Didn't have that, whatever it was they were looking for?
I think you're totally right, and I think that's that's a great point to bring up. One thing that I didn't mention, so this was 6 months into the war, but this was like the first big battle that the Lebanese Communist Party was involved in. It was in West Beirut, and the Kataib Party, that was largely located in East Beirut, was trying to push into West Beirut, and this was seen that if they took it, this would be, you know, the Lebanese army would be able to kind of take it over, and it would no longer be sort of resistance neighborhoods. So the fact that he dies in this battle, and then they actually end up winning it days later, and they kind of repel the Kataib, I think that's one reason that all of them are used, but he is used as sort of what he gave up. Tied to that, when you do see kind of individual martyrs like Imad personified in these martyr narratives, you see a lot of women, and you see a lot of children as well. And I think it's playing a very similar role. With children, it's not look what they gave up for the cause. It's like, look how terrible the enemy is, that they're killing our children. So there's that angle. And in terms of women, it's definitely look what they're giving up for the nation, for the cause, for the struggle. So yeah, I think that's a great point, and something that I'll explore much more in the later chapters of the book. I plan on having one chapter which is just all on public memory as it relates to Imad at the time and sort of the making of him. And if it is to be sort of a true micro history, I mean, it has to speak to those bigger issues that are taking place in Lebanon. Those are great comments.
Dylan?
Yeah, Kelly.
I have a question, and I've been trying to type it in the chat, and I don't think I'm articulating it very well. So I thought maybe I would just ask it.
I like that more.
Okay. I just was wondering how he saw his own position in everything. Did he see himself as like part of this broader global movement, like he may have as a Marxist? Or did he see himself as he was fighting for like this singular Lebanese or Arab cause? Because a lot of the, like, what happens after he dies is that like his memory gets amplified. But yeah, while he was alive, what did he see his own individual role?
Yeah. I think it's. I think he definitely saw himself as part of a global movement, and this really ties into the role that the Palestinian cause plays in global armed decolonization struggles of the 1960s and 70s. There's some great work on this. Cynthia Young, for example, wrote this book called Soul Power, which is all about how African-American activists were borrowing from the PLO. There's another book called Black Palestine, which is about, for example, Malcolm X's trip to Jerusalem, occupied West Jerusalem occupied East Jerusalem, apologies, in, I think he went in 1966 or 7, I forget. So although Imad is often, like in his writings, he's talking about what's going on locally, the Palestinian cause, like we always have to remember the currency that cause had globally. And I think in that way, he definitely saw his movements as part of something much bigger. Claiming that if you beat Zionism, you're going to beat colonialism is tied into this bigger language of, the Palestinian Liberation Organization against the world, or the Palestinian cause against the world.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And I guess that goes back to Nicole's question. That's why I think that he's often referencing the Palestinian cause over, say, Vietnam, over Vietnam, over China, over Cuba. Like they had their own Cuba, China, Vietnam right next door, and they were involved in that. So I think that's why he really kind of plays into that. And I think that a lot of his sort of seeing himself as part of something bigger was really wrapped into talking about Palestine. Anything else, y'all? Happy to take any feedback, any thoughts, whatever it may be. But we can also call today and make it more informal from here if you'd like.
Well, we've taken up the full hour, and
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna stop the recording, y'all. Okay. Cool. I think I stopped it. Did I stop it?
no, it's still showing.
Maybe okay, there we go.